Let's have a look at this map. This is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but 3 weeks ago there was an invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
I have heard something about it on the news.
I know the news hasn't covered it hardly at all, but yes. So this is, as far as we can ascertain, where the borders sit at the moment, and it's reasonably similar to where the borders were sitting last week, to be honest. So you can see Russia has made incursions into the country. They've made reasonable progress in the south, some progress in the east along that sort of long northeast front, and they have forces around Kiev.
That's the key point, though, isn't it? Encircling the capital.
That is useful, but I don't think it actually ties into Putin's war goals particularly strongly. It seems to me like his main objective is to essentially recreate the state of Novorossiya, which is all of the southern areas with the entire coast. So in that sense, Kiev is something of a distraction, but in terms of winning the war and breaking the enemy's will to fight, it could be very useful.
Oh, yeah.
But then, of course, they're having a big problem, which is they are really struggling to take cities, because the Russian army is mainly consists of vehicle-based troops, these so-called battalion tactical groups of tanks and armoured personnel carriers and so on. Tanks aren't very useful in a city.
No.
Guns can only point up about 20 degrees if you're lucky. So.
And the enemy doubtless hide in buildings with RPGs and things like that.
Very hard to get into them. And so we're seeing at the moment that the Russians, they've made some progress in the countryside and they're surrounding a lot of cities, but they are struggling to actually take them.
Yeah.
But we can, I think, conclude that the Russian invasion has not gone as speedily as they may have intended at the start. This is a bit of a slow grind. And according to this site, we can see that actually the Russian losses, if we scroll down, have been quite significant. So this site is reasonably good in the sense that it only counts things where there is a photograph or a video showing it.
Right.
So according to that, it's quite reliable compared to other sites where it's just like, oh yes, the Ukrainian government said they just destroyed 30 helicopters.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah, I'm not taking government press releases on numbers
On war.
In a war, on anything, frankly, as factual. But if you actually have a video or photo evidence of the thing, then I'm much more inclined to believe it.
Well, the good thing about this is that every single one of these, you see that's got 1 destroyed, 2 destroyed, 3 destroyed. If you click on any of those, it will take you to an image of the wreck of the evidence, so that it's all quite well sourced.
Good.
And that's really good. But according to this site, Russia has lost 1,381 vehicles in the last 3 weeks, including nearly 300 tanks. And this is likely to be an underestimate as well, because it's just the ones that have been recorded. So reading between the lines, they seem to be trading with Ukraine at roughly a 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 ratio when it comes to military hardware, which is quite significantly a disadvantage. So I think we can conclude Russia's military is not doing as well as it hoped. What do you think?
I think that the Russians don't care, and that their military tactics for the last 300 years have been essentially attrition, and this is totally what they would have expected.
Really?
I imagine so, yeah. I don't think they're averse to taking losses. I think they're used to that.
I think the Russians certainly have a much higher capacity to take losses than we do in the West. We will almost, even in a war, think that one death is a tragedy.
Yeah.
But I think there does get to a point where even the Russians start to think, hang on a minute, this is too much.
I don't think we're anywhere near it yet.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Well, so that is one perspective, and I've been following this on both sides of the war, and it does seem like one thing I've noticed is a lot of people who have taken that perspective as time goes on and on, it starts to seem less like a slow advance and more like it's stalled in some places, and that sort of thing. And the more that you actually look into the Russian army, the more it seems that there are some really significant weaknesses that emerge that you don't have to be reliant on partial media or partial analysis to understand. And that's what I want to take us through today. Because it turns out that the Russian army has been literally bullied by the Russian people, specifically the Russian mafia.
Okay. How does that happen?
I know. I mean, this sounds ridiculous. Like in Britain, just imagine going up to a British military base and saying, "Oi, pay me protection money." to a 6-foot-tall soldier with
With a gun?
yeah.
I mean, how does that work?
How does it work indeed? Well, to understand that, we have to dig a little bit deeper into Russian culture. And I'm going to take us through this Twitter thread by Kamil Galeev, who we've covered on this channel before. He's got a lot of opinions. Some of them I don't agree with, them. Some of them are a bit closer. He's got qualifications in international relations and so on, I believe 2 master's degrees. And he's been quite prolific on this subject. So, for an insider's perspective on what's going on, let's ask the question, why is the Russian army so weak? Assuming that it is, of course. His TLDR is that the Russian army is not used to fight wars against regular armies. It holds low positions in the Russian dominance hierarchy, the status hierarchy of Russia. The ruling state security fears rivalry from the military and makes every effort to castrate them. So I think that's a very interesting perspective, because if you look through history, and of course you've been covering ancient history recently, it's not uncommon for generals to take over a state.
No, that's a good point. I mean, I don't know what Putin's direct connection with the army and the infrastructure of it and the power structure of it is. I would have assumed it would have been fairly close, but if it's not, I suppose that he's got no choice but to keep them on the periphery.
Well, even when the army is your creature as the dictator of a state, unless you are the general who has seized power by leading it and they have this deep personal loyalty, surely it can still be a significant political threat.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think so. He starts with the assumption here: when Russia invaded, experts thought it would win in 24 to 72 hours. Now, this is an interesting one. A lot of people are now saying, oh, we never thought that. There are some people, let's be fair, who at the start said, no, this is going to be long and bloody, this is going to be a grind, it's not going to be over quickly. But a lot of people genuinely thought, oh, this is going to be over in a few days, it'll be a tragedy, Ukraine's going to be crushed, blah, blah, blah. And now, one of the sort of memory editing things that has happened is suddenly no one ever thought that, which I find really interesting.
Yeah.
But this was an opinion of many people. But 2 weeks later, now 3 weeks, the war is still going, despite the fact that Russia, on paper, has overwhelming superiority. They have 30,000 tanks. They have 1,000 jet aircraft to Ukraine's 60, 70. They should have flattened the air force and just steamrolled through the country, surely, but that's obviously not what happened.
One thing that it seems rather unpopular to say, but it does seem that Russia is playing with kid gloves somewhat. I'm no military expert on Russian forces, but it strikes me that Russia probably could have just started leveling its way through the country if it had wanted to. And the fact that it hasn't speaks to restraint on their part.
Yeah, so I've certainly seen a lot of people saying that in the first couple of weeks, and it is true that Russia has gradually stepped up its intensity of fire, bombardment, and so on. But still, we're yet to see, for example, combined air operations from Russian forces. And in fact, there's a lot of analysts pointing to the potential that the Russian Air Force simply is incapable of mounting large-scale operations with more than 2 planes at one time. And they rely on this analysis by pointing out that Russian pilots only train in small sorties of 1, 2, or 3. And the larger formations they only seem to use for parades, like the Red Arrows almost. And so they're saying, well, maybe the reason they haven't launched these massed attacks, given that Russia has, for example, taken large casualties, not just in the expendable army troops, but in their VDV, the paratroopers who are supposed to be the elite, there is a stronger and stronger argument saying, well, if they're still not using their full power, then maybe it's not because they've got the kid gloves on, maybe it's because they don't know how to punch with them. So there's that argument as well. But let's get into this analysis of the Russian army. So although it projects a warlike image, he claims its military is weak and doesn't know how to fight wars. Big claim, let's consider. Despite a massive PR campaign, Russian military actually has zero experience of fighting conventional wars against other regular armies. They were quite successful in suppressing civilian riots in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and so on. But they were less successful in suppressing guerrilla movements in Afghanistan, join the club, and Chechnya. Oh dear.
Yeah.
And guerrillas didn't have much heavy weaponry, they didn't have proper air defense, and yet Russians suffered high casualties and even lost the First Chechen War, despite overwhelming material superiority. So he continues, since World War II, Russia has never fought a conventional war against a regular comparable army. And that's true. The only exception was Georgia in 2008. Russia invaded to support separatist movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia and defeated the Georgian army. but that's like defeating the Faroe Islands at football.
Yes,
It's not
they're a very
big
small
army.
place.
Yeah. So that was the closest Russia had to a real war in the last 70 years. He continues, individual Russian military specialists fought in the Korean War, Vietnam, Angola, etc., and Syria as well, but the army as a whole did not. The Russian military machine, as an entity from recruitment to logistics, hasn't been checked in a war against a large regular army since 1945. And this is the first experiment that we're having now as to whether it can do that.
Could we not say that about the West as well, though?
We could. Iraq was our last major conventional war.
Yeah.
But we also, in Britain, had a conventional war against Argentina in the Falklands.
That's true. But that was quite small scale, wasn't it? So.
Reasonably so, but
Yeah.
it was still a massive military operation. Iraq, certainly, I think, is our claim. And then also we've had large amounts of troops committed to Afghanistan and so on.
Yeah.
But it is true, and that's a point that's worth emphasizing. Most militaries, especially modern ones, when they go to war, they're usually mobilizing their military strength with the benefit of years and maybe decades of not having actually done it. So they've had all of these theories, they've built new weapons, they've got new theories of warfare, but they don't actually know what the war is going to be like. And so we see, for example, in this war, TB2 drones being super effective, despite the fact that people didn't think they would be that effective. Things like this.
Right. So what we're discovering really is sort of 21st century warfare.
Yes.
What it actually looks like when it's really engaged.
Absolutely. But then it happens so rarely that even though we're discovering it, we run the danger of just deciding that, this is what all 21st century wars will look like.
true.
And then the next one will be completely different. So it's very hard. It's a wicked learning environment in a way. You could have made some very silly assumptions about the war and go into it and then through sheer luck win. And then everyone looks and analyzes the war and decides, well, you knew how to fight the war. This is how all future wars will be fought.
No, absolutely.
It's harsh. But yes, so since 1945, Russian army fought against enemies, neither of which had a regular army of its own. Enemies of Russia had no structure, little training, tiny firepower. To compensate for this, Russia heavily invests in propaganda, glorifying its military. But what do they really look like? And then we get to the Russian Mafia.
Right.
It goes to the next one. In December 2021, thieves-in-law imposed tribute on a Russian military base, making NCOs and officers pay them cash. They specifically target veterans of Syria who earned cash there. They harass, threaten, and beat them. The leader of the gang was arrested, but released after a few months.
I mean, if an army can't defend, if a military base can't defend itself from extortion by thugs, then I can see what do you mean when you say how good are they going to be really fighting a war?
Yeah, and let's remember we're not talking about the so-called super elite formations
No,
like
just
the
the
VDD and the
regular,
paratroopers and so on. But the majority of your army is not going to be elite, even if they occupy a disproportionate amount of headline space.
But your regulars should still have a certain degree of combat effectiveness.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you'd imagine, this is a wacko one-off story. But it's not. It's not an exception. It's a rule. The Russian military is constantly harassed by thieves and forced to pay money. Just 4 random headlines in the next one on how thieves force literally any military, including the ones managing the nuclear rockets, to pay them tribute. The Russian army is a type of prey for the Mafia. And there's these photos of them basically being...
Just okay.
I know.
I mean, if I'm one of the officers, I'm like, right, okay, we're going to learn how to shoot these guns, and then when someone tries to steal things from us, we're going to shoot them.
Yeah, but the Mafia can come in and say, well, we know you're here in this base, but we know where you live. We know where your babushka's living and all of that. So they've got leverage. Let's introduce some sociological context. Russian thieves traditionally portray themselves as the counterculture, the rebels. We don't care about the official law, the law of cops. We only follow the law of thieves. We constitute a parallel state much superior to the official one. And there's a kind of a legendary mythos there. Right?
I can see it, yeah.
Thieves dominate in prisons, believe it or not. Their propaganda is working so well that many naive prisoners really do view thieves as rebels. But then they start doubting the narrative. They wonder, what if thieves play rebels, but in reality are actively collaborating with prison administration? If prisoners refuse to work and try to sabotage the production, thieves will plead, persuade, threaten, and then physically force them to resume their work. Thieves may develop very long and complicated argumentation, but with only one imperative: production goals must be met.
Okay, yep.
That's well reflected in culture. Consider Bespredel, a great movie on how Russian institutional culture, shaped by prison culture, works in reality. A prisoner refuses to work and tells administration. They inform the thieves, and that's what happens. And only much later, prisoners realize thieves are not a parallel state. They're just another branch of the same state machine. They're controlled opposition, which actively cooperates with authorities. They do whatever the state commands and never, ever cross the line, or they're doomed.
They're the Antifa of Russia.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
They think they're the opposition, but they're entirely controlled by the Orthodox state.
Right.
Thieves racketeering the military, including Syria veterans, nuke personnel, and so on, is not an accident. It's a deliberate government policy to keep professional military low in the country's dominance hierarchy. Russian state purposefully keeps its military in this position. It's all part of a plan. Now, why that seems a bit silly, right? Why would you want your military to be completely ineffective and bullied and harassed by thugs? That doesn't seem like a way of building an effective state, does it? But he continues to describe why that might be the case. The Russian military are harassed, abused, and low in hierarchy. Of course, the lowest position ever is taken by conscripts. There are many publications on how conscripts were forced into gay prostitution to earn cash for higher-ups.
Okay. Humiliating your soldiers is not going to make them effective soldiers.
No, but when you
101.
haven't fought a conventional war for 70 years,
Are
maybe
these
that
even
doesn't
necessary?
matter.
Yeah.
Maybe they're just your posse. You can use them however you wish if you're a senior officer.
Well, I mean, are they even a posse? They seem like livestock in a way.
Yeah.
You know, these are conscripts. They've got no choice. They're paid for by the state, so they're guaranteed to have wealth. They're guaranteed to have money, and so we can just take it from them.
Well, I've been criticising the Russian conscription thing as a long-term social security plan rather than anything to do with the military, and this certainly seems like it.
Especially if they don't fight wars.
But why would the Russians develop such a plan? And he goes on, higher-ups are afraid of the army. Russian thieves play rebels being a part of the state apparatus. The same way, Russia plays a military regime being, in fact, a state security regime. So we know Putin's a KGB man, of course. Yeah. The domination of state security, the new nobility, over all other institutions is a particular feature of Putin's regime. This hadn't been the case in the USSR. State security rule is the major innovation of Putin. State security, though, are not the military. That's another institution which has very uneasy relations with soldiers. State security will easily suppress any civilian revolt with guerrillas. Oh, for goodness sake. Sorry, I've lost my... state security will easily suppress any civilian revolt and any guerrilla. Thus, the only inner force that could overthrow Putin and so on would be the army.
And so the army is kept in a state of perpetual humiliation and
absolutely
wretchedness.
Yes.
In order to never be able to find the morale needed to overthrow Putin.
Yeah. Right. And he goes on to talk about some of the ways in which they do that. So one precaution is to do a cleansing after each military conflict, because they have conflicts in Syria and so on. So in peacetime, the power of military generals is low. They're bounded by institutions, protocols, guidelines. They're watched by state security. They've got military prosecutors, so they're kept in check that way. But during the war, this control basically disappears. So the longer the war lasts, the less procedural and more personal military power becomes. Soon, nobody cares about procedures because it's about life or death. It's about winning the war. Everything is done by personal oral orders. Troops get used to unquestioning obedience to a general's word. So you have to do a cleaning up after the war.
So he has to purge people with experience and knowledge of military activity.
So what he's doing is he's getting rid of all of the competent generals. Because that's dangerous. So what does that do? Isn't that a kind of selection pressure?
Yes, a negative one.
It's an evolutionarily negative selection pressure to ensure that your army is run by the least competent people in it.
Yes. And it's the army itself is demoralized and weak and ineffectual and run by incompetence.
Yeah. So do you think this is going to produce an effective fighting force? No. It seems like a recipe for disaster, if you ask me.
Yes, it sounds like the very worst way of running an army.
Absolutely. And he points out another couple of things that they do. So they clean up the generals, they actively promote state security agents to army positions. And you can regularly find Russian military personnel. They'll give their long patriotic speech, but then they'll also complain that they'll never get a promotion because of politics. Then they also have an extreme and unbelievable anti-intellectualism in the army.
Right.
Especially among military officers. And that's to minimize the internal threat.
Yes, you don't want intelligent, competent, experienced people leading the army if you're basically a gangster.
So to minimize the threat from the army, they attack the army mythos as well. And this is where the Mafia comes in. Right? Why would the Mafia even dare to racketeer military officers? You can't even imagine it happening in the West, right? Well, it's because they know that in case of a conflict, the state will back the Mafia. Because the Mafia stand much higher in Russian hierarchy than soldiers. Yeah. And so you get thieves harassing bases, you get soldiers forced into gay prostitution. All it does is eliminate the army mythos so that you have no more rivals for power.
So there's no self-confidence within the army. I grew up on military bases. I'm a forces brat. And so, I've my whole life I've grown up on military bases. The British and American militaries are run in the used to be run in the total opposite direction of this because they were legitimate.
Right.
The state was legitimate and no one thought that they were going to overthrow the state.
Yeah.
And so we have an effective army because of that.
And the final point he makes, which I think is worth thinking, he points out that Russia's army is artillery-centric.
Yep.
Well, consider that in a political context. You must be artillery-centric if you have low morale troops, because no one respects them. They don't respect themselves. They can't stand a close-range fight. They just want to be out of there.
Yep.
And so if they trained capable, high-morale infantry, intelligent officers, it would be a mortal political threat. So they maintain low-morale, incapable infantry with the dumbest officers possible and kill the brighter ones. Then the only way to fight that war is with artillery.
And this perfectly explains why Russia has failed to take cities. If the desire of the Russians is not to level everything in Ukraine and instead bend Ukraine to its will, you can't just start shelling something from 100 miles away. Now you've got to send in these just weak ground troops to try and do anything. And the Ukrainians are, of course, not in that position. They want to defend their homeland, respectively, and so they fight with a much more effective animating force.
Absolutely. I mean, if this was the army that I was fighting with, I would never start a war. But then I think that the Russian regime was not intending to start a war either.
Right.
I think the indications are that they got enough intelligence reports that they thought this would be like Crimea. Yeah. They move the troops in, the Ukrainians switch sides, they take the territory they need, job done. That's why it's a special military operation, not an invasion. But now I think that they seem to have found themselves in a war and they are panicking like headless chickens. So one of the heads of the intelligence services was arrested, and the argument is that he was arrested for essentially feeding false information in the lead up. And if you watch their body language and everything, the Russian high command, I think they're a little struggling at right now.
High command is probably a bit of a misnomer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very low in the pecking order for high command.
Oh, I mean Putin and
right.
The regime
Sorry,
he does,
but okay, that's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating because, I mean, when I did work experience in the various military administrations and things like this, and my dad always wanted me to join the RAF like him, but I was too much of a person who wanted to do my own thing. But you get to see the kind of people involved and the idea of trying to make your men, trying to humiliate them, deprive them of their self-respect, and then expect them to fight a war. It's just the utter antithesis of what you need to win a war. You're just sending men out to their deaths or to fail, if that's the case. I imagine desertion from the Russian army is just staggering. Absolutely staggering. So that's fascinating. I had no idea about the internal workings of Russian military.
I brought it up. I know it might seem a little speculative, but I've heard these stories from people I've known from Russia and from Eastern Europe, but mainly Russia. And this very much ties together the social side of the jigsaw puzzle with the military side.
I don't see how else you can explain gangsters robbing military bases without the military literally being so demoralized they wouldn't even consider fighting back, because there's no camaraderie, there's no teamwork, there's no esprit de corps that's been built between them. They're all sort of essentially atomized and isolated, so they can be predated on in this way.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as this Epoch series, and this one in particular being on the life of Napoleon, that Carl and Bo have done together on the early life of Napoleon. And if you want to follow Carl and see what else he's putting out, you can follow him at Getter at @CarlBenjamin on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.